The morning of March 23, 1942, Subic Bay, Philippines. Lieutenant Henry Brantingham stands on the deck of motor torpedo boat 41, watching his torpedo man load the final Mark 8 into the launch tube. The weapon slides into place with a metallic click that should sound reassuring. It doesn't. Not anymore. In his pocket, Brantingham carries a photograph of his wife and a folded piece of paper, a letter he's been writing and rewriting for 3 weeks. The letter asks a question he's not supposed to ask, a question that violates every principle of naval discipline. What do you do when you know your weapons don't work, but your orders demand you keep using them anyway? 4 months into the Pacific War, American PT boat crews have fired more than 200 torpedoes at Japanese vessels. The official kill count, verified by post-battle reconnaissance, stands at 0. Not 0 capital ships, not 0 destroyers, 0 vessels of any kind. And yet, every night, young men like Brantingham climb into their plywood boats, race toward enemy convoys, and fire torpedoes they've come to call Moby Dicks, expensive, elusive, and entirely mythical in their effectiveness. The Japanese know this. Imperial Navy intelligence reports from February 1942 contain a detail that should have triggered alarm bells across the Pacific Fleet. Japanese commanders have stopped taking evasive action when American PT boats attack. They simply maintain course and speed, watching the torpedoes run harmlessly beneath their hulls or detonate prematurely in their wakes. Some Japanese captains have begun timing how long it takes the American boats to realize their weapons have failed and retreat. This is not a story about cowardice. The men firing these torpedoes are volunteers, many of them Ivy League graduates, who abandoned comfortable futures to fight. This is not a story about incompetence. The tactics are sound, the approaches textbook perfect. This is a story about what happens when a military bureaucracy becomes so invested in its own infallibility that it sends men to die rather than admit it made a mistake. And it is a story about how 700 failed torpedoes became the most damning indictment of American naval preparedness in the entire war. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. To understand how the United States Navy found itself in this position, we must return to 1933, to a small testing facility in Newport, Rhode Island, where a group of engineers believed they had solved one of warfare's oldest problems: how to sink an enemy ship without having to aim directly at it. The magnetic influence exploder, designated the Mark 6, represented a theoretical breakthrough. Unlike contact exploders that required a torpedo to physically strike a ship's hull, the magnetic system would detonate when it detected the change in Earth's magnetic field caused by a steel vessel's mass. The torpedo would run beneath the target, and the explosion would create a bubble that would lift and break the ship's keel, catastrophic damage from a near miss. On paper, the concept was elegant. In controlled testing off Newport, where the water was calm, the magnetic fields predictable, and the test vessels cooperative, it worked beautifully. The Bureau of Ordnance, the Navy department responsible for weapons development, was so confident in the design that they classified it at the highest level of secrecy. Submarine commanders weren't told how it functioned. Torpedomen weren't allowed to examine the mechanism. Even the existence of the magnetic feature was considered classified information. This secrecy would prove catastrophic, but in 1938 it seemed prudent. The Mark 14 torpedo incorporating the Mark 6 magnetic exploder entered production. At $10,000 per unit, equivalent to roughly $220,000 today, It was expensive enough that the Bureau limited live-fire testing. Why waste money shooting expensive torpedoes at target vessels when the theoretical models were so convincing? Between 1938 and December 1941, the United States manufactured approximately 1,500 Mark 14 torpedoes. Fewer than 10 were ever fired at actual targets under combat-like conditions. The rest were distributed across the fleet based on mathematical projections and laboratory data. Submarine commanders received them with full confidence. PT boat squadrons loaded them with pride. Destroyer captains inventoried them with satisfaction. And then, on December 7, 1941, the theoretical war became real. The first indication that something was wrong came not from Pearl Harbor, where the Japanese attack left little time for torpedo warfare, but from the Philippines, where American submarines and PT boats began engaging Japanese invasion convoys in the war's opening weeks. Lieutenant John Bulkley, commanding PT Squadron 3, led the first American torpedo attack of the Pacific War on January 24, 1942, in the Makassar Strait. Bulkley was not a man prone to excuses. A Naval Academy graduate and experienced officer, he had trained his crews relentlessly. His attack plan was textbook: approach at night, close to within 500 yards, fire a full spread, and withdraw at maximum speed. The Japanese convoy consisted of 5 transports and 2 destroyers, slow, vulnerable targets silhouetted against the moon. PT-34, PT-35, PT-41, and PT-32 made their runs. 16 torpedoes launched. The crews watched the wakes run straight and true toward their targets, and then nothing. No explosions, no damage. The torpedoes simply passed beneath the Japanese hulls or ran past them entirely. The destroyers, rather than evading, began a methodical counterattack, forcing the PT boats to withdraw under fire. Bulkley's after-action report, filed on January 26, 1942, noted torpedo performance unsatisfactory. This was a naval understatement of the highest order. What Bulkley actually told his squadron was considerably more direct. Gentlemen, either we're the worst torpedo boat crews in history, or these fish are duds. The submarine force was discovering the same problem, though their situation was more dangerous. Unlike PT boats, which could retreat at 40 knots, submarines had to remain in enemy waters, often within depth charge range, to observe their torpedo results. Commander John Cromwell, aboard USS Sculpin, fired 4 Mark 14 torpedoes at a Japanese cruiser on January 30, 1942. Range, 800 yards. Angle, perfect 90-degree broadside. Speed calculations, verified by 3 separate officers. All 4 torpedoes ran beneath the target. Cromwell, watching through the periscope, saw them pass under the cruiser's keel without detonating. The cruiser, rather than taking evasive action, simply adjusted course toward Sculpin's last known position and began dropping depth charges. Cromwell barely escaped. His report was more technical than Bulkley's, but equally damning. Torpedoes set for 10-foot depth passed beneath the target estimated draft of 18 feet. Possible depth control malfunction. By February 1942, reports were flooding into Pearl Harbor. USS Sargo, 8 torpedoes fired, 0 hits. USS Skipjack, 10 torpedoes fired, 1 hit that failed to detonate. USS Pollock, 6 torpedoes fired, 2 hits that bounced off without exploding. The pattern was undeniable to anyone willing to look at the data objectively. The Mark 14 torpedo had multiple cascading failures, The problem was that the Bureau of Ordnance in Washington was not willing to look objectively. Captain William Coe, director of the torpedo section, reviewed the initial reports and issued a response that would become infamous in naval history. Submarine commanders are experiencing difficulty due to inadequate training in torpedo fire control. Recommend refresher courses in approach procedures. The implication was clear. The weapons were fine, the men were failing. This verdict infuriated the submarine force, but it had a perverse logic. The Mark 14 had been tested not extensively, but tested. The theoretical models were sound. The engineering was sophisticated. If there were problems, surely they would have emerged during development. The alternative that the Navy had spent millions of dollars on a fundamentally flawed weapon and was now distributing it fleet-wide without proper testing was too catastrophic to consider. And so, the torpedoes kept firing, and kept failing. Lieutenant Commander Lawson Red Ramage, executive officer aboard USS Trout, decided to conduct his own investigation. Ramage was an engineering officer by training, and he had access to something most submarine commanders lacked: detailed technical documentation of the Mark 14's depth control mechanism. In March 1942, while Trout was undergoing refit in Pearl Harbor, Ramage obtained permission to conduct an unauthorized experiment. He requisitioned a fishing net and suspended it at precisely measured depths off the coast of Oahu. Then he fired 3 practice Mark 14 torpedoes, set for 10 feet, through the net. All 3 struck the net at 22 to 23 feet, more than twice the set depth. Ramage repeated the test with different settings. Every torpedo ran 10 to 12 feet deeper than configured. The mechanism responsible was the torpedo data computer's depth control system, which relied on a hydrostatic valve and a pendulum device to maintain running depth. The design had been tested in controlled conditions, but never calibrated for the widely varying temperatures, salinities, and pressures of different ocean environments. In the warm, saline waters of the Pacific, the mechanism consistently malfunctioned, causing the torpedo to run deep. Ramage's report, complete with photographs and measurement data, arrived at the Bureau of Ordnance on March 28, 1942. The response, dated April 9, 1942, dismissed his findings. The testing methodology employed does not conform to Bureau standards. Depth control mechanism functions within acceptable parameters under controlled conditions. No fleet-wide modification authorized. Translation: we don't care what you found in the field. Our laboratory says it works, but the field evidence continued mounting. By May 1942, American submarines had fired nearly 400 Mark 14 torpedoes in the Pacific. Confirmed kills, fewer than 20. Expected kills, based on pre-war calculations, over 150. The discrepancy represented not just wasted ordnance, but wasted opportunities: Japanese transports that reached their destinations, warships that continued operations, and American submarines that exposed themselves to counterattack for no tactical gain. The PT boat situation was even more desperate. Unlike submarines, which could patrol for weeks and choose their engagements carefully, PT boats were assigned specific defensive zones and ordered to attack any enemy vessels that entered. In the Philippines, where General Douglas MacArthur's forces were retreating toward Bataan and Corregidor, PT boats represented one of the few remaining offensive capabilities. They were expendable assets crewed by expendable men, and they were being expended at an alarming rate. Lieutenant Robert Kelly, commanding PT-34, wrote in his personal diary recovered after the war, an entry dated April 3, 1942. Attacked transport tonight. Fired all 4 fish. Perfect. Setup. Not one exploded. Zeros caught us on the way back. Lost Morrison and his entire crew. 34 men died because the damn torpedoes didn't work. How do I write that letter to his mother? How do I say he died for nothing? The Bureau of Ordnance never saw Kelly's diary. They saw only official reports, which were required to follow specific formatting guidelines and use approved terminology. Words like failure, defective, and catastrophic were discouraged in favor of below expected performance or requires further evaluation. This bureaucratic filtering meant that the raw anger and desperation of field commanders was sanitized into technical language that suggested minor problems requiring minor adjustments. Meanwhile, the Japanese were not merely observing American torpedo failures, they were adapting their tactics to exploit them. Intelligence reports intercepted by American codebreakers in May 1942 revealed that Japanese convoy commanders had been issued new standing orders. When attacked by American PT boats or submarines, maintain course and speed unless the torpedoes detonate on impact. If they detonate prematurely or fail to detonate at all, ignore them and focus on locating the launch platform for counterattack. The Imperial Navy had calculated the odds. With an American torpedo failure rate exceeding 70%, the safest course of action was to not evade. Evasive maneuvers wasted fuel, disrupted convoy formations, and created opportunities for follow-up attacks. Simply ignoring malfunctioning torpedoes and hunting the attackers proved far more effective. This was the ultimate humiliation. The enemy had stopped fearing American torpedoes entirely. In June 1942, the submarine force reached a breaking point. Admiral Charles Lockwood, recently appointed Commander Submarine Force Pacific, was a career submariner who had commanded boats in World War I. Unlike the bureaucrats in Washington, Lockwood spent his time visiting submarine tenders, talking to commanders, and reading unfiltered patrol reports. What he found appalled him. Lockwood was particularly struck by the report from USS Tinosa, commanded by Dan Darspit. On July 24, 1942, Tinosa encountered the Japanese whale factory ship Tonan Maru no. 3, a massive, slow target dead in the water off the coast of Truk. The ship was stopped, conducting repairs, completely vulnerable. Darspit maneuvered into perfect position, range 900 yards, and began a methodical attack. He fired 15 torpedoes. 11 struck the hull directly. Darspit could see the impacts through his periscope. Not one exploded. Frustrated beyond measure, Darspit saved his last torpedo and returned to Pearl Harbor with it, demanding that Bureau inspectors examine a torpedo that had been prepared for combat but not fired. The inspection revealed the third catastrophic flaw, the contact exploder mechanism. Even with the magnetic feature deactivated, the Mark 14's backup contact exploder was fundamentally flawed. The firing pin mechanism, designed in the 1920s, couldn't withstand the impact of a high-speed collision at a perpendicular angle. When a torpedo struck a target at the optimal 90-degree angle, the shot every torpedo man trained for the firing pin crushed before it could trigger the detonator. A perfect shot caused a mechanical failure. The better your aim, the less likely your torpedo would explode. The implications of this discovery were staggering. For 8 months, the United States Navy had been sending its most sophisticated weapons platform submarines capable of operating for weeks behind enemy lines into combat with torpedoes that had 3 separate, catastrophic design flaws. The depth control didn't work, The magnetic exploder didn't work, and even when everything else functioned, a direct hit would prevent detonation. Admiral Lockwood assembled his staff in August 1942 and presented them with a question that bordered on mutiny. What if we simply stopped following Bureau of Ordnance guidance and fixed the problems ourselves? The legal implications were severe. Modifying ordnance without authorization violated naval regulations. If a modified torpedo malfunctioned and killed American sailors, the officers responsible would face court-martial. But Lockwood's logic was brutally simple. The torpedoes were already killing American sailors by not working. How much worse could unauthorized modifications be? On September 1st, 1942, Lockwood issued a confidential directive to all submarine commanders in the Pacific. Deactivate the magnetic influence exploder. Use contact mode only. This was direct defiance of Bureau of Ordnance specifications, which mandated magnetic mode for all attacks. Lockwood didn't ask for permission. He simply ordered it done and waited to see if Washington would respond. The Bureau of Ordnance. Response arrived 3 weeks later, and it was everything Lockwood expected: a formal reprimand, a demand for immediate compliance with approved procedures, and a thinly veiled threat of relief from command. The message concluded with a statement that would become notorious among submarine veterans. The magnetic influence exploder represents years of developmental investment. Field commanders will utilize this technology as designed. Lockwood's response was equally direct. He sent Washington a compilation of patrol reports from the previous 6 months, highlighting every torpedo failure, every missed opportunity, every submarine that had been depth-charged while observing its torpedoes malfunction. He included casualty figures, submarines lost, sailors killed, and asked a simple question: how many more men need to die before the Bureau admits there's a problem? The standoff lasted until November 1942, when 2 things happened simultaneously. First, USS Wahoo, under Commander Dudley "Mush" Morton, returned from patrol with a confirmed kill record that seemed impossible. Morton had sunk 4 Japanese vessels in one patrol, more than most submarines achieved in a year. His secret? He fired massive spreads of torpedoes, 8 or 10 at once, knowing that even with a 70% failure rate, sheer volume would produce hits. Second, the Navy's Logistics Command reported that submarine tender stocks were depleting faster than anticipated. The reason was obvious. If submarines had to fire 3 times as many torpedoes to compensate for failures, they consumed ordnance 3 times faster. The Bureau of Ordnance was facing a choice between admitting the torpedoes were defective or explaining to Congress why they needed triple the manufacturing capacity. They chose a third option: quiet capitulation. In December 1942, the Bureau issued a technical bulletin, not an admission of fault, but a field modification guideline that authorized submarine commanders to deactivate the magnetic exploder at their discretion in certain tactical situations. The wording was deliberately vague, allowing the Bureau to maintain they hadn't reversed course while giving Lockwood exactly what he wanted. But this solved only one of 3 problems. The depth control issue remained, and field modifications could only go so far. Submarine tenders began conducting their own depth calibration tests, using the net method Ramage had pioneered, and manually adjusting each torpedo's depth mechanism. It was time-consuming, technically complex, and entirely unsanctioned. But it worked. The contact exploder problem proved more intractable. Redesigning the firing pin mechanism required metallurgical expertise and manufacturing capabilities that didn't exist in forward bases. Torpedoes continued to bounce off enemy hulls throughout 1943, though with the depth and magnetic issues partially resolved, the success rate climbed, from abysmal to merely poor. For the PT boat crews, these bureaucratic victories came too late to matter in the Philippines. By May 1942, Bataan had fallen. By June, Corregidor had surrendered. The PT boats that survived, fewer than half of the squadrons deployed, evacuated to Australia with MacArthur. They carried with them a bitter lesson. Courage and skill meant nothing when your weapons didn't function. Lieutenant John Bulkley, who had led the first torpedo attack of the war, was awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions in the Philippines. The citation praised his extraordinary heroism and distinguished service. It made no mention of the fact that his squadron had fired 47 torpedoes with 0 confirmed kills. The medals were for bravery, not effectiveness. Bulkley himself understood this distinction. In a 1943 interview not published until after the war, he stated, "We did everything right and achieved nothing. The boats performed, the crews performed, the tactics were sound. But when your primary weapon doesn't work, performance is meaningless. You can be the best torpedo boat crew in history and still accomplish nothing. The psychological toll of fighting with defective weapons cannot be overstated." Modern military psychology recognizes that soldiers need to believe their actions matter, that their courage serves a purpose, that their sacrifices achieve objectives. When weapons consistently fail, that belief erodes. Patrol reports from mid-1942 contain an undercurrent of despair that regulations couldn't suppress. Commander Sam Dealey, aboard USS Harder, wrote in his patrol log on August 15, 1942, "Fired 6 fish at transport, 4 hits, 0 detonations. Crew morale deteriorating, men openly questioning whether headquarters knows or cares that weapons are defective. I have no answer to give them because I share their suspicions. This was dangerous territory. The military functions on trust that commanders know what they're doing, that equipment will function, that sacrifice serves a purpose. When that trust breaks down, discipline follows." Lockwood understood this, which is why he pushed so hard for authorization to fix the problems. He wasn't just trying to sink more Japanese ships, he was trying to prevent a morale collapse in the submarine force. The Bureau of Ordnance, isolated in Washington and insulated from combat realities, failed to grasp this dynamic. They saw field commanders as complainers making excuses for poor performance. They saw patrol reports as data points requiring statistical analysis, not desperate pleas from men risking their lives with defective equipment. The bureaucratic distance between Washington and the Pacific created a fundamental disconnect, one side dealing with abstract engineering problems, the other with concrete life and death consequences. This disconnect reached its apex in January 1943, when Captain Ralph Christie, the Bureau's chief torpedo expert, traveled to Pearl Harbor to personally oversee testing. Christie was a brilliant engineer and a stubborn advocate for the Mark 14. He arrived convinced that the problems were tactical, not technical, and that proper testing would vindicate the weapon. Lockwood arranged a demonstration. USS Muskellunge conducted a series of carefully controlled attacks against a target hulk anchored in shallow water where impacts could be observed directly. Christie watched through binoculars as torpedo after torpedo struck the target without detonating. When one finally did explode, it was a glancing blow at a 20-degree angle, the worst possible shot according to doctrine, but the only angle at which the firing pin didn't crush on impact. Christie, to his credit, immediately understood the implications. The Mark 14's contact exploder was fundamentally backward. It rewarded poor shots and punished perfect ones. He returned to Washington and authorized an immediate redesign of the firing pin mechanism. By September 1943, new exploders began reaching the fleet. 21 months into the war, American torpedoes finally began working as intended. The transformation was immediate and dramatic. In October 1943, American submarines sank 42 Japanese vessels, more than they had sunk in the entire previous year. Commander Morton aboard Wahoo, previously celebrated for overcoming torpedo defects through sheer volume of fire, now achieved devastating efficiency. His November 1943 patrol sank 6 ships with 14 torpedoes, a success rate that would have been impossible with the earlier Mark 14 models. The PT boats, operating in the Solomon Islands campaign, experienced a similar renaissance. Squadron 10, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Robert Bulmer, sank 3 Japanese destroyers in 2 weeks during December 1943. There, tactics hadn't changed, their weapons finally worked. Crews who had grown cynical about torpedo attacks regained confidence. The weapon that had been a liability became an asset. But for every success story in late 1943, there were ghosts from earlier failures. USS Sculpin, which had fired the war's first documented deep-running torpedoes, was lost with all hands in November 1943. USS Wahoo, despite Morton's skill, was sunk in October 1943 during a patrol where torpedo malfunctions forced multiple attack runs, extending exposure to Japanese countermeasures. 17 submarines and over 90 PT boats were lost in 1942 and 43, not all due to torpedo problems, but many while conducting attacks that should have succeeded and didn't. The human cost of the Mark 14 scandal extends beyond casualties to encompass opportunities lost. Every Japanese transport that reached port delivered supplies that sustained enemy forces. Every warship that survived continued operations against Allied vessels. Historians have attempted to quantify this impact, and while exact figures remain debatable, conservative estimates suggest that functional torpedoes in 1942 could have reduced Japanese merchant tonnage by 200 to 300,000 tons, equivalent to roughly 30% of their carrying capacity in the early war period. Sunk 15 to 25 additional Japanese warships, potentially including 2 carriers damaged but not destroyed in battles where American submarines made unsuccessful attacks. Shortened certain island campaigns by degrading Japanese supply lines more effectively, though quantifying this in terms of lives saved or time reduced remains speculative. What is not speculative is the logistical burden imposed by defective torpedoes. Submarines carried 24 torpedoes per patrol. If each required 2 or 3 shots to compensate for failures, patrol effectiveness dropped by 2/3. This meant more submarines needed to achieve the same results, which meant more construction, more crews, more training, more support infrastructure, all consuming resources that could have been applied elsewhere. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Bureau of Ordnance's failure was not primarily technical. Engineers make mistakes, designs have flaws, testing can't anticipate every real-world condition. The unforgivable failure was institutional, the refusal to acknowledge problems when evidence became overwhelming, the dismissal of field reports from experienced commanders, and the prioritization of bureaucratic face-saving over combat effectiveness. This pattern repeated with the Mark 13 aerial torpedo, used by Navy and Marine aircraft. Pilots reported similar problems: deep running, premature detonation, dud, hits throughout 1942. The Bureau's response was identical: blame the pilots. When Lieutenant Commander John Waldron led Torpedoes Squadron 8 to its destruction at Midway in June 1942, all 15 aircraft were lost. The official narrative emphasized Japanese fighter superiority and the bravery of American air crews. What it didn't emphasize was that even the few torpedoes that reached their targets failed to detonate. Waldron's squadron died heroically, but they died firing weapons that didn't work. The Mark 13 wasn't fixed until mid-1943, following the same pattern as the Mark 14. Field reports ignored, problems denied, mounting casualties, eventual grudging acknowledgement, and belated repairs. By the time functional aerial torpedoes reached the fleet, the Navy had largely abandoned torpedo bombing in favor of dive bombing, which proved more reliable. The institutional psychology behind these failures reveals how large organizations can become trapped by their own narratives. The Bureau of Ordnance had spent 2 decades developing the Mark 14. Senior officers had built careers on its success. Budgets had been justified based on its capabilities. Admitting fundamental flaws meant admitting that years of work, millions of dollars, and institutional credibility had been wasted. The psychological pressure to deny problems, to reinterpret evidence, to blame external factors, was immense. This is not unique to the Navy or to World War II. It's a pattern that repeats whenever organizations invest heavily in technologies or doctrines that fail in practice. The Space Shuttle Challenger disaster, the Ford Pinto's fuel tank design, the Tacoma Narrows Bridge collapse all involved warning signs that were dismissed by experts too committed to their designs to acknowledge fundamental flaws. What makes the Mark 14 case particularly egregious is the timescale. The first reports arrived in January 1942. Definitive fixes weren't implemented until September 1943, 20 months. 600 days during which the problem was known, documented, and ignored. 600 days during which men died firing weapons that bounced off enemy ships or ran beneath them without detonating. The Japanese response to American torpedo improvement in late 1943 provides a final irony. Intelligence reports from November 1943 show Japanese convoy commanders suddenly reinstating aggressive, evasive maneuvers when attacked. After nearly 2 years of treating American torpedoes as minor nuisances, they recognized that something had changed. American submarines were suddenly dangerous again, but the war had moved on. By late 1943, Japanese merchant shipping was already stretched to the breaking point. The islands that would become the major battlegrounds, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, were being reinforced at maximum capacity. Earlier interdiction, when Japanese logistics were more flexible, might have prevented those reinforcements. Instead, American submarines spent 1942 and early 1943 firing torpedoes that didn't work, while Japanese convoys operated with relative impunity. The final accounting is impossible to calculate precisely. How many battles would have gone differently if Japanese reinforcements had been sunk en route? How many American lives would have been saved if island garrisons had been starved of supplies? How much sooner would the war have ended if submarine warfare had been effective from December 1941 instead of October 1943? These questions have no definitive answers, only estimates and counterfactuals. What is certain is that the Mark 14 torpedo scandal represents one of the most consequential technical failures in American military history, not because the weapon was flawed, but because the institution refused to admit the flaw existed until the evidence became impossible to ignore. By 1944, the Pacific Submarine Campaign had become the most effective anti-shipping operation in naval history. American submarines sank over 600 Japanese vessels that year alone. Tankers, transports, and warships disappeared beneath the waves with mechanical regularity. The transformation was so complete that Japanese military planners began routing convoys based not on tactical advantage, but on which routes submarine concentrations made least dangerous. There were no safe routes, only degrees of risk. This success makes the earlier failures more painful, not less. Lieutenant Commander Richard O'Kane, commanding USS Tang, became the most successful submarine skipper of the war, with 31 confirmed kills. His patrol reports from 1944 demonstrate what functional torpedoes could achieve: precise attacks, high success rates, efficient use of ordnance. But O'Kane had been executive officer aboard USS Wahoo during 1942, when Commander Morton fired spread after spread at Japanese vessels with minimal results. O'Kane knew exactly what those 2 years of defective weapons had cost. Tang's final patrol in October 1944 ended when one of her own torpedoes malfunctioned, not a depth or exploder failure, but a circular run that brought the weapon back toward the submarine. The torpedo struck Tang's stern and exploded, sinking her. O'Kane and 8 crewmen survived. 78 did not. The inquiry determined that a gyroscope malfunction caused the circular run a different defect than the Mark XIV's earlier problems, but a reminder that torpedo reliability remained imperfect even after the major fixes. The PT boat campaign followed a similar trajectory. By 1944, squadrons operating in the Philippines and New Guinea were achieving kill rates that justified their tactical doctrine. Lieutenant Commander Robert Leeson's Squadron 21 sank 4 Japanese destroyers in 3 months during the New Guinea campaign. The boats that had been written off as ineffective in 1942 became essential components of MacArthur's island-hopping strategy. But the men who had survived the early campaigns carried psychological scars that functional torpedoes couldn't heal. Ensign Joseph Roberts, who served with Squadron 3 in the Philippines during 1942, returned to combat with Squadron 21 in 1944. His personal letters, donated to the Naval History and Heritage Command after his death in 1998, reveal a persistent distrust of his weapons. "We've been told the fish work now. The tests show they work, but I still expect them to fail. Every time I hear the launch, I'm waiting for nothing to happen." You can't unlearn that expectation. This psychological legacy extended beyond individual veterans to institutional memory. Post-war submarine force training emphasized weapons testing and field verification in ways that pre-war training had not. The assumption that laboratory performance predicted combat performance was replaced by a doctrine of persistent skepticism: test everything, trust nothing, until proven under realistic conditions. This represented a fundamental shift in how the Navy approached weapons development. The Bureau of Ordnance itself underwent significant restructuring after the war. The Torpedo Division, which had resisted field reports and maintained faith in theoretical models, was reorganized with new leadership and new protocols. But accountability for the Mark XIV failures remained elusive. No officers were court-martialed, no formal apologies were issued. The official post-war histories acknowledged the problems, but framed them as unfortunate technical difficulties rather than institutional failures. Captain Ralph Christie, who had witnessed the broken firing pins in January 1943 and authorized the redesign, became a rear admiral, and continued his naval career without censure. His role in finally fixing the problems was noted. His earlier defense of the defective design was quietly forgotten. This pattern repeated throughout the Bureau. The officers who had dismissed field reports, threatened subordinates, and delayed corrections faced no professional consequences. Admiral Charles Lockwood, by contrast, became a celebrated figure in submarine force history. His willingness to defy the Bureau of Ordnance and authorize unauthorized modifications was vindicated by the submarine campaign's success in 1944 and 1945. After the war, Lockwood wrote extensively about the torpedo scandal, ensuring that the submarine force's perspective entered the historical record. His accounts are detailed, angry, and unforgiving, a sharp contrast to the Bureau's sanitized official histories. The question of accountability extends beyond individual officers to systemic responsibility. The Mark XIV's problems were not sabotage or conspiracy. They were the product of institutional dynamics that prioritized theoretical validation over empirical testing, secrecy over transparency, and bureaucratic authority over field experience. These dynamics exist in every large organization, military or civilian. The Mark XIV scandal demonstrates what happens when they go unchecked. Consider the decision-making process that led to limited pre-war testing. The torpedoes were expensive and budgets were constrained. Testing them extensively would have revealed the problems, but would also have required explaining to Congress why millions of dollars in ordnance were being expended on tests. The Bureau chose to conserve resources and rely on engineering models. This was not irrational given peacetime budget constraints. It was catastrophic once war began. Similarly, the secrecy surrounding the magnetic exploder was justified by genuine security concerns. If the Japanese learned about the magnetic influence capability, they could develop countermeasures degaussing their hulls or modifying their magnetic signatures. But that secrecy also prevented the submarine force from understanding how the weapon worked, which made field troubleshooting impossible. Commanders couldn't diagnose problems they didn't know existed. Security and effectiveness came into direct conflict, and security won. The resistance to field reports reflected another understandable but damaging dynamic. The Bureau received thousands of reports during the war, many contradictory, many from inexperienced commanders, many colored by the chaos of combat. Sorting legitimate technical problems from tactical errors, bad luck, or simple human unreliability required judgment. The Bureau's judgment was wrong, but the task itself was genuinely difficult. They dismissed real problems because they looked superficially similar to imagined ones. None of these explanations excuse the Bureau's failures. They explain how intelligent, dedicated officers could make catastrophically wrong decisions and persist in them despite mounting evidence. The lesson is not that individuals were incompetent, but that institutional structures can channel competent people toward incompetent outcomes. The Bureau of Ordnance was staffed by engineers who had succeeded in peacetime development. They failed in wartime adaptation because the skills and incentives were different. The broader strategic impact of the Mark XIV scandal remains debated among military historians. The most aggressive interpretation suggests that functional torpedoes from December 1941 could have shortened the Pacific War by 6 to 12 months by more effectively interdicting Japanese supply lines during the critical early period. The most conservative interpretation argues that Japanese strategic overextension would have led to the same outcome regardless of torpedo performance, just with different tactical details. The truth likely lies between these extremes. Functional torpedoes wouldn't have changed the fundamental strategic balance. American industrial capacity still dwarfed Japan's. The island-hopping campaign would still have advanced, and Japanese decision-making would still have been flawed. But effective submarine warfare in 1942 would have accelerated Japanese logistical collapse, potentially shortening certain campaigns and reducing casualties in others. What is not debatable is the human cost measured in individual lives. USS Grenadier sunk in April 1943 after a torpedo attack failed and Japanese aircraft caught her on the surface. USS Runner lost in June 1943 under circumstances suggesting a prolonged attack that functional torpedoes might have completed more quickly. PT-44 sunk in January 1943 after revealing her position with torpedoes that failed to detonate. Each loss represented not just crew deaths but families destroyed, futures erased, and potential unfulfilled. The memorial at the Submarine Force Library and Museum in Groton, Connecticut, lists 52 submarines lost during World War II, 3,700 men who never returned. Not all died because of torpedo failures, but some did. The exact number will never be known because combat is chaotic and causation is complex. A submarine lost during a prolonged attack might have survived if earlier torpedoes had worked, or it might have been sunk by factors unrelated to weapons performance. The uncertainty doesn't erase responsibility. It makes the loss harder to bear because we cannot even properly account for the cost. The PT Boat Memorial in Washington, D.C. lists 99 boats lost and 500 crewmen killed. Again, not all attributable to torpedo failures, but some clearly were. Lieutenant Robert Kelly's diary entry about losing Morrison's crew after a failed torpedo attack represents one documented case. How many others went unrecorded? Beyond deaths, there were careers damaged and lives diminished. Commander Sam Dealey, whose patrol log revealed deteriorating morale in August 1942, was lost with USS Harder in August 1944. He had survived the period of defective torpedoes, achieved success with functional ones, and died in combat after the problems were fixed. But his earlier reports about crew morale suggest psychological costs that outlasted the technical failures. Men who learned to expect their weapons to fail carried that expectation even when it was no longer warranted. The post-war treatment of torpedo scandal participants reveals another dimension of institutional failure. The submarine commanders who had documented the problems and demanded fixes, Lockwood, Ramage, Dealey, Morton, Cromwell, received recognition and decorations. But the recognition was for combat success, not for the earlier struggle to fix defective weapons. The narrative became, brave submariners overcame early difficulties and went on to win the campaign. The narrative should have been, brave submariners identified critical weapon failures that negligent bureaucrats refused to address, and men died because of that refusal. This sanitized narrative served institutional interests. The Navy needed public confidence in its weapons development process. Emphasizing that the Mark XIV had been fundamentally broken for 20 months would have raised uncomfortable questions about oversight, testing, and accountability. Easier to frame it as early war difficulties that were addressed through improved procedures. The passive voice obscures responsibility. No one is explicitly blamed, so no one faces consequences. The same pattern appeared in the Mark XIII aerial torpedoes history. Torpedo Squadron 8's destruction at Midway became a story about heroic sacrifice, not defective weapons. The pilot's bravery was real, but emphasizing courage while minimizing equipment failure creates a dangerous precedent. It suggests that individual sacrifice can compensate for institutional negligence, that if men are brave enough, it doesn't matter whether their weapons work. This is false. Bravery without effective weapons is waste. The men who died firing defective torpedoes were no less brave than those who died firing functional ones, but their deaths achieved less. That truth is uncomfortable because it implicates decisions made far from the battlefield by people who never faced enemy fire. But discomfort doesn't make it untrue. The Mark 14 scandal offers several enduring lessons for military organizations and large institutions generally. First, field experience must be weighted heavily against theoretical models. Laboratory testing cannot replicate combat conditions. Assumptions valid in controlled environments fail in operational reality. When experienced personnel report systematic problems, the default assumption should be that the problems are real until proven otherwise, not that the personnel are incompetent until proven otherwise. Second, secrecy and security must be balanced against operational effectiveness. The magnetic exploders classification prevented enemy knowledge, but also prevented friendly troubleshooting. Sometimes the enemy learning about a capability is less dangerous than your own forces being unable to understand or fix it. Security classification should never be used to avoid accountability or suppress legitimate criticism. Third, institutional investment in a technology or doctrine should not prevent acknowledging its failures. The Bureau of Ordnance's 2 decades developing the Mark 14 created psychological pressure to defend it against criticism, but sunk costs are sunk. Defending a failed investment wastes additional resources and lives. Organizations need mechanisms to cut losses and change course when evidence demands it, even when such changes are professionally embarrassing or politically costly. Fourth, accountability matters. The absence of consequences for officers who dismissed legitimate reports and delayed critical fixes sends a message that institutional loyalty is more important than operational effectiveness. Future officers learn that defending organizational positions is safer than acknowledging organizational failures. This creates cultures where problems are hidden rather than solved. Fifth, veterans' experiences must be preserved and studied honestly. The submarine force's institutional memory of the Mark 14 scandal helped create a culture of persistent testing and healthy skepticism toward untested weapons. But that institutional memory required veterans like Lockwood to document their experiences despite official pressure toward sanitized narratives. Organizations need mechanisms to capture and preserve critical internal perspectives, even when those perspectives are unflattering. The modern U.S. Navy teaches the Mark 14 scandal at the Naval Academy and in submarine officer training. The case study focuses on the importance of testing, the dangers of overclassification, and the need to listen to operational forces. These lessons are valuable, but they often omit the accountability question. The lesson isn't just test your weapons, it's hold people responsible when they refuse to acknowledge that weapons don't work. In recent decades, the Mark 14 story has been revisited by military historians and technical analysts. Some work has focused on the engineering failures, how the depth control, magnetic exploder, and contact exploder each failed independently, and how their cascading failures created such comprehensive weapon ineffectiveness. Other work has examined the institutional dynamics, analyzing how organizational culture and bureaucratic incentives created resistance to acknowledging problems. The most valuable analyses do both. They explain the Kapakami technical failures and the institutional responses as interconnected rather than separate. The torpedoes didn't just happen to be broken, they were broken because of how they were developed, tested, and deployed. And they remained broken because institutional structures prevented rapid correction. Technical and institutional failures reinforced each other, creating a disaster that neither alone would have produced. For the families of men lost during the period of torpedo failures, these historical analyses offer cold comfort. Navy widow Margaret Waldron, whose husband commanded Torpedo Squadron 8 at Midway, spent decades advocating for fuller disclosure of the Mark 13's problems. She believed correctly that the emphasis on her husband's heroism was being used to obscure the weapon failures that contributed to his death. Her letters to the Naval History and Heritage Command, written between 1968 and her death in 1994, repeatedly requested that official histories acknowledge the torpedo problems more explicitly. The responses she received were polite, sympathetic, and fundamentally evasive. Official historians acknowledged that torpedo problems existed but emphasized that multiple factors contributed to Torpedo Squadron 8's losses. This is true but incomplete. Multiple factors contributed, including Japanese fighter superiority, flawed tactical doctrine, and lack of fighter escort. But defective torpedoes were also a factor, and minimizing that factor to preserve institutional reputation dishonors the men who died. Margaret Waldron's advocacy represents a broader pattern of families seeking acknowledgement that their loved ones' deaths involved not just enemy action, but American failures. These families don't want their veterans' courage diminished. They want the full context preserved. A sailor who dies firing a defective weapon is no less brave than one who dies firing a functional weapon, but acknowledging the defect is necessary to prevent future repetitions. The Mark 14 scandal's final irony is that the weapon eventually worked extraordinarily well. By 1944 and 45, the Mark 14, with its corrected depth control, disabled magnetic exploder, and redesigned contact mechanism, was arguably the most effective submarine torpedo in the world. American submarines achieved kill rates that German U-boats, operating with their own torpedo problems, never matched. Japanese anti-submarine warfare proved unable to counter the American submarine offensive once weapons functioned properly. This success makes the earlier failures more frustrating. The tactical doctrine was sound. The submarines were well designed, the crews were trained and motivated. The only missing element was functional weapons, and that element was missing because institutional arrogance prevented acknowledging and fixing known problems. Everything else was right. One thing was wrong, and that one wrong thing cost years, ships, and lives. In 1945, as the war ended, the Bureau of Ordnance quietly began developing the Mark 18 torpedo, intended to replace the Mark 14. The development process incorporated lessons from the Mark 14's failures, extensive field testing, regular consultation with submarine commanders, and rapid prototyping of modifications based on operational feedback. The Mark 18 program represented an institutional learning process, though the lessons came at tremendous cost. By the time the Mark 18 entered service in late 1945, the war was effectively over. Japan's merchant fleet was destroyed, their navy was shattered, their ability to resupply island garrisons was gone. The weapon arrived too late to matter strategically, but early enough to validate the corrected development process. Post-war torpedo development continued with the Mark 18's philosophy: test extensively, listen to operators, fix problems immediately. The submarine veterans who had fought with defective Mark 14s in 1942 viewed these developments with mixed emotions. vindication that their reports had been accurate and their criticisms justified, anger that corrections took so long, grief for the men who died before fixes were implemented, and a grim satisfaction that future submariners wouldn't face the same betrayal by their own weapons. Thank you for reading. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. The 700 torpedoes that Imperial Admirals laughed at represent more than a technical failure. They represent an institutional failure to acknowledge reality when reality contradicts expectations. They represent the cost of bureaucratic pride, measured in ships not sunk, objectives not achieved, and lives not saved. And they represent a lesson that every generation must relearn, that courage and skill mean nothing without effective tools, and that providing effective tools is a moral obligation, not a technical preference. The laughter of Japanese admirals in early 1942 was earned. American torpedoes were a joke, and the enemy knew it. But by 1944, the laughter had stopped. Japanese convoy commanders dreaded American submarines with good reason. The weapons finally worked, and the consequences were devastating. The transformation from joke to nightmare took 20 months and cost thousands of lives that effective weapons from the beginning could have saved. History remembers World War II's Pacific submarine campaign as one of naval warfare's great successes. 6% of American Navy personnel accounted for 55% of Japanese shipping losses, an extraordinary achievement. But that success was delayed, diminished, and purchased at unnecessary cost by weapons that didn't work and a bureaucracy that refused to admit it. The men who fired those 700 failed torpedoes deserved better. They deserved weapons that functioned. They deserved leaders who listened. They deserved an institution that valued their lives more than its pride. Some survived to see the weapons fixed and the campaign succeed. Many did not. All paid the price for failures that were predictable, preventable, and inexcusable. That is the true cost of the Mark 14 torpedo scandal. Not just ships that weren't sunk or battles that were prolonged, but the betrayal of trust between warriors and the institution they served. That betrayal, once experienced, can never be fully repaired. It becomes part of institutional memory, a permanent reminder that courage means nothing without competence, that bravery cannot compensate for betrayal, and that the laughter of enemies is sometimes earned by the failures of friends. The memorial walls list names, not explanations, but behind every name is a story, and behind some of those stories are torpedoes that ran too deep, or detonated too early, or struck true and failed to explode. Those men deserved the truth told plainly. They were brave, they were skilled, and their weapons failed them. All three statements are necessary. The last explains why the first two weren't enough.